Over to the gridiron, and let's take an updated look at how Brett's AP Top 5 stacks up against Colin's power ratings. Just like last week, Georgia sits atop the #1 spot, but there are some changes throughout. Of note, Oregon has continued to fall down Brett's rankings. Entering as a preseason #1, the Ducks fell to 3 last week, now sit outside of the top 5, and replacing them are the Miami Hurricanes as Cam Ward continues to dazzle. But like Miami, like most teams inside the top 25, as we welcome in Colin Wilson and Brett McMurphy now to talk about college football, the Hurricanes are near 7 touchdown favorites, and that kind of feels like the takeaway. A lot of ranked teams with a lot of high spreads. But let's take a step back. Let's look at, the college football playoff as a whole with this weekend, because, a loss against an unranked team in a high spread could lead to some doubt come the CFP. Brett, I'll start with you. What team what game in particular do you think has the biggest playoff implications?
Friday night, Arizona's at Kansas State. The Wildcats are 7-point favorites, and the Wildcats are 7-point underdogs. See what I did there?
Yeah.
This is actually a non-conference game. It was scheduled a few years ago before conference realignment, but now that they're both in the same conference, the schools decided to keep the game, but it will not count in the conference standings. Well, why is that significant? The winner of this game could come into play later in the season, because what if the loser of this game actually fares better in the conference standings, gets to the Big 12 title game, either wins or loses the Big 12 title game? Well, the winner of this game would have the head-to-head, quote, tiebreaker, although it wouldn't impact the conference standings. That could come into play, and I think that would be relevant to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee if you're judging Arizona and Kansas State later in the year on who wins this game in September.
It will be interesting to see how this game plays out. It really feels like this is the marquee matchup. There's only 2 ranked games total on this slate. Colin, I'm going to kick it to you next. No Texas, Michigan, no Tennessee, NC State like last weekend, but it might be a blessing because those were stinkers. What game do you think in particular has the biggest playoff implications?
Well, it's interesting that Brett mentioned a Big 12 team, because a Big 12 game was exactly at the top of my list. People don't understand that half of that conference can win the conference championship and get themselves a top 4 seed in the playoff. That makes these contenders that are outside of Oklahoma State and Kansas State, it makes every game crucial. So the biggest game of the weekend is Central Florida going on to take on TCU. Now, TCU is looking to restore some magic, what they had 2 years ago. Meanwhile, UCF is just trying to belong with a just powder keg full of talent that they got through the transfer portal. But the difference in this game is going to be what UCF does on the ground with a running back that they had last year, and that's RJ Harvey, who just had 4 touchdowns last week. But he has 6 on the season. He has some sort of crazy 7 yards after contact right now. And when you consider what the Gus Malzahn Wildcat is, it's inside zone read with KJ Jefferson, a play in the offensive playbook that was tailor-made for him. But RJ Harvey is creating all these yards, creating all these touchdowns strictly off of inside zone. If you turn around and look at TCU's defensive line, it hasn't gone real well from a run defense perspective. I expect UCF to eat TCU's defensive line all day. And then on the other side, the Frogs, Josh Hoover is an interesting passer. He has some coverage looks where he's pretty good. He's pretty good against cover 1. He's pretty good against cover 2. He's horrific when you go cover 6, cover 4, quarters, cover 3. UCF only plays a strict cover 3, especially with Ted Roof there now as defensive coordinator, to stop explosive passes. I think UCF's going to have their way on the road, and they are going to put a leg up in the Big 12 and stake their claim as we are for real and can make the playoff.
We're going to have more on this game and also Arizona, Kansas State in just a sec. But I need to pull back a little bit, guys. I need to ask a question. Brett, don't come at me too hard for asking this one, but Oregon, it was not a great game against Boise State. They were near 20-point favorites, ended up having to go on to the last drive, the last play of the game, a game-winning field goal for the Ducks. After a scare in week 1 also against Idaho, if it weren't for 2 special teams, we could be looking at the Ducks being 1-1, this big, bad Oregon team from the Pac-12 coming over, changing conferences and expecting to win. And is there any concern at all? I'll ask you first, Colin. Should we be concerned for Dan Lanning's Ducks?
The answer is no. I know it looks bad right now, and I've dropped them in the power ratings. I think they're down to 7th if you like the overall power rating rank, but they're 10 points behind Georgia on a neutral field right now if they were to play each other. But why am I not sweating any Oregon futures or any Oregon tickets? Because the problems that they have can be fixed. If you think of LSU in 2019, the defense was giving up 30 to everybody. They gave up 30 to Vanderbilt. And then Dave Aranda, who was the defensive coordinator at the time, made changes to tackling, angles, everything on the defense, and it completely revamped that LSU defense, and they turned things around. When you look on the offensive side, the offensive line has had some guys move around, playing not in their natural positions. Dillon Gabriel's had pressure. He's been a little bit off sync. Once they get healthy on the offensive line, once the fundamentals come back and tackling on the defense, you're going to see a different Oregon team. So, we've seen Oklahoma State lose to South Alabama last year. Just sometimes these teams need a couple games to get in sync, and I think that's where Oregon is. There is no lack of talent, and there is no lack of coaching with this entire program.
Yeah, that last week game against Boise State, had the team total over, had the guy on the deep route. We didn't even deserve it, Colin. Had 2 go routes and overthrew him. Made me go ballistic at like 1 a.m. just in the corner of my bedroom. But yeah. Listen, Brett, we talk about Oregon, and Colin just mentioned the offensive line and how that's changing up. They allowed 5 sacks last season, have already allowed 7 in 2 games to Gabriel this year. I know you had them number 1. For sure, the talent's there. They've continued to fall down with some questionable games. Are you worried at all about Oregon's future?
No, look, we'll see if they're going to win the Big Ten or not. Ohio State, comes to Eugene later in the season. But ultimately, I think they've got too much talent, kind of what Colin addressed, that they will end up in the playoffs somewhere, somehow. They're going to make the 12-team field. It is surprising, though, that, like you guys touched on, the offensive line has really struggled. And that Lanning told me this offseason, that was supposed to be a strength. And you kind of saw against Boise State, like you said, Charlie, they had 2 kickoff returns for touchdowns. Look, Boise should have won that game. They deserved to win that game, no question about it. But Lanning made a more concerted effort to run the ball, kind of the stretch runs out to the corner, and had some success there. But ultimately, if they can't protect Gabriel, that's really going to limit what they can do offensively. I think they'll be fine. They've got to improve. They can't play like this and have a chance to make the playoff. But like Colin said, I think they will improve. Charlie, I'm just glad after you asked me last week if Dabo Swinney was on the hot seat, if you're going to ask me if Lanning was on the hot seat, because you read it on the left side of Twitter somewhere. But Lanning's job security is fine. Dabo won by 70, so he's fine for another week. So looking forward to this week of college football.
Yeah, Clemson looked really good. And listen, the left side of Twitter is more saying stuff about Dillon Gabriel and how bad he is under center and how he was ridiculous that he wasn't. Now he was the number 1 in the Heisman, but, I digress. We'll stay off the left side. We'll talk about, this weekend slate as a whole. And listen, last week we saw Notre Dame go down to NIU. No one thought that was going to happen after Notre Dame went and beat Texas A&M. We thought that they were going to then, just sail off into the sunset into the college football playoff. Well, how about this week? You look at the matchups. There's only 2 teams from Friday and Saturday with a spread, at least for ranked teams, under 10 points. So I ask you guys, and Colin, I'll start with you first. Who is the team that's on upset alert when it comes to ranked play?
Well, we mentioned the game already, but it's going to be Friday night with Kansas State hosting the Red Cats. Yes, Arizona is whipping out these red helmets, red uniforms. It's going to be, they actually look pretty beautiful. But when you look at where Kansas State has had problems so far this season, they're 128th in defensive passing success rate. Their coverage has not been good. It's outside the top 75 as graded by PFF. And you say, well, what's the Arizona offense? Well, Noah Fafita hitting Tedoroa all the way down the field and taking advantage of teams that can't defend in coverage has been a problem for Kansas State, and that's exactly where Arizona's going to attack. So I know the number has come off 7. It's gone back up to 7.5. Even I power rate this around 8 or 9, so I can understand the buyback here on Kansas State. But Arizona has the ingredients on offense to put a real scare into Kansas State on Friday night.
Brett, how about you? I know, this is an interesting game that you're going with, and I actually think it could happen. Tell me more about why you think Oklahoma in particular could be on upset alert.
Yeah, Oklahoma's got major injury issues. I actually just talked to an Oklahoma source 10 minutes ago, and they were playing their 4th-string center last week against Houston. And they said, look, even if we would have won that game by 4 touchdowns, we still have some issues injury-wise. They have to get this stuff figured out. Can they get it figured out in, less than a week? It's doubtful. Also, not that they're overlooking Tulane because Tulane's a quality team, but next week, Josh Heupel, the last quarterback to win a national championship at OU, comes to town. It's OU's SEC opener. That is going to be the biggest game and biggest home game in school history. If they're slightly peeking ahead to that, if they still have these injury issues, Tulane's the kind of team that can go into Norman and upset the Sooners. That last week, they did lose to Kansas State. They outgained Kansas State by over 100 yards, yet lost at home. This is a dangerous, dangerous spot for the Sooners.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And you mentioned the Tulane gave Kansas State a run for its money. This number opened over 2 touchdowns, come down now to about 13.5 in the market. So there's definitely some, Tulane money pouring in, and it's definitely a concern. Oklahoma, they're stuffed at the line on the run game, and Jackson Arnold just 174 yards, 19 of 32 last week in a scare against Houston. But of course, guys, we can't let you go without a best bet. We're taking a long shot here by picking out upsets, but we need an actual bet for the weekend slate. Brett, you're up first. You're heading back to the big house, fresh off a Michigan loss, drubbing of Texas, and you'll like Arkansas State to hang here.
Yeah, Arkansas State getting 24. Look, Michigan all off season, they were prepping, they were preparing for the Texas game. They didn't show anything against Fresno State. Guess what? They didn't show anything against Texas either. So maybe they really don't have anything. For Arkansas State quarterback Jalen Renoir, can he possibly get the fighting Butch Jones? Can they get the double figures? I think if they can, then you're asking a Michigan offense to score 5 or 6 touchdowns. I don't think they can do that. This is a huge, huge sandwich spot. Who's on deck for Michigan? Some team named USC. Yeah, you're playing between Texas and USC, and you're playing Arkansas State. This is kind of like when you're invited to go to something and you're forced to go to it and you don't want to go. You have to go, and you're just, all right, I'll go. It's kind of like Michigan playing Arkansas State this week. All right, we got to play them this week. I think it stays close. I don't think Arkansas State's going to pull an NIU by any means, but I'll take the 24 and take my chances that Arkansas State can get on the board and make Michigan put up 5 or 6 touchdowns.
Listen, Brett, I mean, you might be able to have an open tryout and start at quarterback for Michigan based on how their quarterback play has gone through the opening couple of weeks. But Colin, your best bet, we mentioned the UCF game, TCU, how important that one is in playoff implications, and you like UCF to get the job done.
I do, for a lot of the reasons I spoke of before. And I almost took Florida in this spot against Texas A&M with the points, but you guys, everyone can download the BBOC podcast tomorrow when Stuckey and I get done chopping it up, because I think I'm going to be on the Gators. But here we're going to take UCF for all the things that I mentioned before. But let me throw out one more stat about what happened at TCU in week 1 against Stanford. If you go and look at quarterback Ashton Daniels, he had 114 yards rushing. 57 of those came off designed run attempts. That's Ashton Daniels of Stanford with no offensive line. You're going to be able to handle KJ Jefferson when he pulls back on the inside zone read and decides to handle it himself at 260 pounds. I don't think it's going to be a good game for TCU's defensive line whatsoever. If Stanford can run wild with a quarterback on TCU's defensive line, so can UCF. So give me the Knights. If you're having a bingo card at home, we had mention of the left side of Twitter. We've had an Arkansas player reference with KJ Jefferson. Colin had to get that in there with UCF, but definitely feels like a great spot. Both undefeated teams, and TCU surviving the scare against Stanford, but really has looked a bit concerning here through the opening couple of weeks. But Colin Wilson, Brett McMurphy, thank you so much for hopping on, and we'll talk to you guys next week.